When listening to the wittering assurances of ministers of the Prime Minister today about the blood scandal, and indeed about the post office, and indeed about Windrush, and indeed about Malkinson, and I'm sure there's something I'm forgetting now, but it just goes on and on and on. These wittering apologies, which mean nothing. I think what's important is to put them next to what Longstaff said in his statement. And he's conducted a serious review of the contaminated blood problem. And I was talking to somebody this evening, and we were talking about whistleblowers in the NHS and the way in which they are persecuted, and the way in which the government has spent so much money, and the NHS has spent so much money trying to silence these people who are only trying to do good. And yet we find when we enter the NHS as a patient, there isn't enough money to go round. If your GP thinks maybe your blood pressure is too high, there's a long waiting list for a blood pressure monitor, and you go for weeks and weeks or months waiting for this single blood pressure monitor, which is doing the rounds because there isn't the money to supply the NHS surgeries with the tools that they need. And yet there's enough money to persecute people who try to do the right thing. Longstaff said, this disaster, the NHS blood contamination, and I take this quite personally because I'm on the haemophilia scale myself, and I think it's pure chance that I was not infected. And I'm grateful every day that I was not infected. But when it came to serious surgery, and I went into hospital twice, this well-documented blood condition was the cause of delay and stupidity by the NHS. And it wasn't about the consultants, it was about the management and the bureaucracy and the utter failure of one hospital to talk to another, of one part of that hospital to relay the information to another. So in the second case, while I was suffering cancer, while I was getting cancer surgery, I was given ridiculous off-the-shelf drugs, which would never have worked. And 2 weeks later, they accordingly did not work, and I was then hemorrhaging badly for about a further 2 weeks. I needed to be readmitted to hospital, and it was a very frightening time for me, and it was a very expensive time for the NHS, and it was completely unnecessary. If the NHS bureaucrats had actually done their job in the first place and hadn't interfered. And it's their interference to try and save money, because they're so busy spending money attacking people who are trying to do good, who are whistleblowing. So Longstaff, again, to go back to the infected blood, this is what he said. He said, this disaster was not an accident. And the response of the government and the authorities, the NHS and successive governments, compounded the agony and maintained that people received the best available treatment, and that testing began as soon as it was available. He says both these claims were untrue. And I don't think it's only about that. It's that deceit is built into the NHS, the post office, the legal system, and so on, because it's about control. And we live in a society which claims, which bluffs, that it's a democracy. It's not. It's a society where a small number of individuals have control. It's not about their superior intellect or their skill or their experience. It's about who they knew to get up the slippery pole and achieve that position that takes the decisions. Because many of the people at the top of the NHS have barely got an O-level or an A-level between them. And yet, the sheer academic drudgery of becoming a doctor, the years it takes, the skill it requires, and they're tossed off with a wage when they're junior doctors, which is less than the wage of somebody cleaning the streets. If we are not ashamed of this, and if we are not ashamed of the whittering politicians who've gone on television today to promise money, it's just promises. Have you seen any of this money? Have you seen any of it? It's just promises, and this comes days, significantly, after a conference organised in Wimpole Street, drawing attention to the treatment of whistleblowers in the NHS. Days. Days. Do we believe the government? Do we believe the senior managers of the NHS when they say it's all going to get better? I don't.